I've been asking myself, was Big a big mistake? Carrie Bradshaw and Mr. Big, one of television's most iconic and debated relationships. Some people see them as soulmates, destined to find each other no matter what. Others see them as a cautionary tale, a relationship full of imbalance and emotional turmoil. The question I want to explore is, was this true love, or was it infatuation, otherwise known as limerence? Because intensity and chemistry aren't the same thing as a healthy bond, even though we're often told that they are. I'm Sophie. I'm a therapist specialising in attachment patterns and relationships, and the author of several books on the topic, which you can find in the description below. In this series, I break down fictional couples through a psychological lens to understand the patterns beneath the surface and how they mirror real-life relationships. I'll be using the framework from my book Letting Go of Romantic Obsession to help unpack these dynamics. A quick note before we begin, this is an educational interpretation of fictional characters. These are opinions and not clinical diagnoses. Throughout these videos I'll be using the term limerence. Limerence is an intense form of romantic fixation where your thoughts, mood and sense of self become tied to another person's attention or approval. It often feels euphoric at first, but underneath it's driven by anxiety, uncertainty and unresolved emotional wounds. It's not based around a secure connection or genuine love. Some people might call it obsession, unrequited love or wanting someone you can't have, and limerence is just the psychological term for that experience. So as we look at Carrie and Big, from their first meeting to their many breakups and reunions, I couldn't help but wonder, was it love or was it limerence? Let's dive in. Relationship overview. Carrie Bradshaw is a relationship columnist living in New York City. She feels things intensely, is emotionally expressive and sees love as a guiding force in her life. She processes her inner world out loud through her writing, her friendships and her relationships. Mr. Big, real name John, is wealthy, older and emotionally reserved. He's charming and confident, but consistently uncomfortable with vulnerability. He values independence and keeps his inner world guarded. Carrie and Big meet early on in the series and quickly form a physical relationship. And what follows is a long-term, on-again, off-again dynamic defined by emotional inconsistency. Big gives just enough intimacy to keep Carrie hopeful, but never enough to make her feel secure. Carrie repeatedly seeks clarity, reassurance and commitment, and Big repeatedly pulls back, avoids labels, and withdraws when emotional closeness is required. This creates a classic dynamic. Carrie chases while Big maintains distance. Even when they're not together, Big remains emotionally central in Carrie's life. He reappears at key moments, often when Carrie is trying to move on, reigniting hope and restarting the cycle all over again. Indicators of limerence. One of the clearest signs of limerence is how early on Big is placed on a pedestal. Almost immediately she describes him as out of her league, and Samantha also calls him the next Donald Trump because of how wealthy and powerful he seems to be. Their first meeting is very telling. He literally picks her up off the street and after asking about her job he mistakes her for a sex worker, and yet she's still intrigued. That moment establishes a power imbalance. He assumes authority and Carrie adjusts herself to fit into his perspective. She even names him Mr. Big, which is a label that reinforces how extraordinary and unattainable he is to her. Carrie doesn't see Big as an equal. She sees him as something to be won, which sets the tone for everything that follows. From the very beginning, mood dependence is clear, and in episode 2, Big introduces Carrie to a model he's seen. Instantly she feels small and insecure, and her emotional state shifts based entirely on his actions. Even before the relationship starts, she's already experiencing the highs and lows, the rush of attention and the crash of feeling inferior. There's also that cafe scene shortly after their failed first date, where he invites her to dinner. She walks away confidently and says, "Call me," and then voiceovers, "Maybe all men are a drug. Sometimes they bring you down, and sometimes they get you so high." So she's already aware of the emotional highs and lows before the relationship has even begun. She sneaks a look back, catches him checking her out and lights up. That dopamine hit sets the tone for everything that follows. As the relationship develops, the idealization intensifies. We really see it peak in the infamous fart episode. The fart itself was probably the least of Carrie's problems. but to her it symbolises being human and therefore not compatible with a mythical being like Big. She sees how she's exhausted from trying to be perfect, and she's terrified of letting him see her real self. She also says outright how much effort it takes to live up to what she imagines he is, and how afraid she is that if she slips he'll leave, which is a big indicator of limerence. Rumination is another hallmark. When Big doesn't introduce her to his mother, Carrie spends the entire night pacing and looping questions in her mind. What does this mean? What am I to him? This obsessive thinking is classic limerence. She even reaches a point where she's willing to give up her entire life for him by offering to move to Paris without even considering her own needs. At the same time, Carrie is consistently ignoring red flags. He cancels, he dates other women, he doesn't make space for her in his life, he belittles her career, calling her column cute, he cheats on his wife with her best friend, and Carrie explains it all away. Big's hot and cold behaviour, moving closer when he feels he's losing her and pulling back when he feels secure, is intermittent reinforcement, one of the strongest drivers of addiction to another person. That's when I first realised it. I was in an S&M relationship with Mr. Big. After their second breakup, it gets even more intense. She cannot stop talking about him. She reframes the pain by convincing herself she was the best thing that ever happened to him and that she pities him. And not because she believes it, but because she wants to soothe her ego. Even outside his engagement party to Natasha, she launches into a monologue about how she's too wild for him and how he doesn't get it. Again, this isn't about what she believes, it's about trying to regain her emotional power after rejection. Even when Carrie is with someone who truly shows up for her like Aidan, she can't detach from Big. The compulsion and the inability to step away, even when you know it's destructive, is a defining feature of limerence. Her entire sense of well-being becomes dependent on his approval. When he withdraws, she's anxious and deflated. When he shows affection, she's euphoric. She mistakes this emotional rollercoaster for chemistry, which is usually the opposite of compatibility. How it developed. To understand why Carrie becomes limerent for Big, we need to look at how their connection begins. Limerence almost always starts with a very specific spark, a mixture of attraction but also uncertainty. Their first meeting, Carrie bumps into Big on the street. He's handsome and confident and clearly someone important. And then there's a small, seemingly insignificant moment, a little wave, which gives her just enough hope of possibility. And that's what romantic obsession feeds on. That tiny wave becomes the glimmer, the first sign that this larger-than-life figure has noticed her, and from that moment the seed has been planted. Almost immediately, Big's behaviour reinforces the fantasy, but in unpredictable ways. He doesn't pursue her in a straightforward linear way, but he appears and disappears and pops up where she is, drops intriguing words and then vanishes. Just enough interaction to keep her thinking about him. Even when they do eventually go on a date, he's flaky. The connection never stabilises and there's always a sense that she hasn't quite won him over yet. And that uncertainty is crucial. Obsession doesn't thrive on stability, but ambiguity. Timing is also a big factor here. Carrie is newly single and freshly detached from Kurt, who functioned as her previous limerent object, who she was only able to detach from because she thought she'd got one up on him. And when that ends, Big appears almost immediately. There's no emotional gap or reset and her interest is free to transfer seamlessly. She's also in a life phase centred on dating. Her column revolves around love, sex and relationships, and Big is material and a story that fits perfectly into her narrative. There's also another layer, money and status. Carrie is financially unstable. Big represents security and power and access to a world she desperately wants to be a part of. In her eyes, he's the gateway to the lifestyle she's always wanted but fakes her way through, and being chosen by him would significantly improve her worth in all aspects. The Limerence cycle. As soon as Carrie becomes fixated on Big, their relationship moves into a predictable loop. The thing is, a limerence cycle isn't about building and progressing together, it's about one person constantly reacting to the other. It usually begins with hope and the subsequent fantasy. Big reappears, he calls, shows up and gives Carrie the attention she craves. She feels chosen and safe again. She then starts imagining what this could finally become. Maybe this time it's different, and maybe now he's ready. Take the episode where Carrie tells him, "I love you." That moment is full of hope and vulnerability, and then Big shrugs it off and doesn't say it back, which completely destabilizes her. This cycle shifts into distance and withdrawal mode. Big hasn't done anything dramatic, but emotionally he's pulled back. Carrie feels the safety disappear, which causes anxiety to spike. Her nervous system goes into overdrive because her sense of security depends entirely on his response. Instead of grounding and reassuring herself, self-abandonment kicks in. That night she leaves Big at a party and goes home with the waiter, and not because she wants to, but because she needs to in order to regulate the pain. It's a mixture of self-soothing, self-sabotage, and an unconscious attempt to regain power. If she can be desired by someone else, maybe she won't feel so rejected. Then comes the intermittent reward. The next day, Big calls, and he's intense, almost confrontational, and suddenly he says,
"Well, I love you. Alright? You know I do."
Relief finally washes over Carrie and her anxiety disappears. She's back in the relationship, and the emotional roller coaster has come full circle. This is how attachment deepens in limerence. The nervous system learns that enduring anxiety eventually leads to reward, and the cycle repeats: hope and fantasy, then distance, then anxiety, then self-abandonment and sabotage, then intermittent reward, and then reinforcement, over and over again. That's why it feels so addictive. The relief after distress feels like proof of connection and compatibility. Her nervous system learns, if I endure the anxiety, if I don't leave, and if I wait it out, eventually I'll be rewarded. But in reality, the unpredictability is doing the bonding through intermittent reward and dopamine. And Carrie remains trapped in the loop for years because her nervous system is hooked. The effects of limerence. Over time, we can see how the limerence cycle changes Carrie in numerous ways. The most obvious impact is on self-esteem. When Big shows interest, she feels alive and confident, but when she senses rejection, her self-worth plummets. She sees his distance as proof that there's something wrong with her, rather than incompatibility. We also see an erosion of her identity. Carrie tries on different versions of herself to appeal to Big, like she's auditioning for the role of woman he'll choose. The naked dress, the dominatrix top hat outfit, the French beret look, the candy striper nurse costume. None of it's what Big asked for, but she anticipates what might make her more desirable instead of expressing who she truly is. Even the more subtle things change. When Big's ex-wife compliments her hair, Carrie begins straightening it every day, assuming it's what Big would also prefer. Even when she quits smoking when she's with Aiden, as soon as Big re-enters and they have an affair, she's lighting up all over again.
"If you smoke, I smoke too. That's how much I'm in love with you."
Boundaries also weaken. She invites Big to Aiden's cabin, crossing relational and ethical lines. She engages in phone sex with Big while dating Burger because she can't seem to say no. Her boundaries just don't seem to exist whenever he's involved.
Can we lighten up on the boundary talk?
Carrie also learns to tolerate breadcrumbs. Minimal gestures like a hidden photo or a toothbrush head feel enormous because they arrive after such deprivation. And the most painful effect is how she neglects healthier options. She has a loving, emotionally available relationship with Aiden, and yet she throws it all away for Big. Even when Big's barely lingering in the background, he dominates her mind. Other men are an afterthought as she compares them all to him. Limerence narrows your focus until only one person matters, and it's almost impossible to have those types of feelings for anyone else. Big becomes the reference point for her worth, her choices, and her sense of self. What the limerent person wants. When you strip it all back, what Carrie really is chasing isn't just love, but certainty, validation, and to be rescued. Consciously, she wants full reciprocation. She wants Big to meet her where she's meeting him with the same amount of effort and intensity. She wants him to choose her openly and confidently because that choice would validate her worth and that she belongs in his world. If he did that, she believes something inside her would finally be permanently healed. Being loved by this powerful, wealthy, emotionally elusive man would elevate her and prove that she's good enough, not only romantically but socially too. Being chosen by Big would place her at the top of the metaphorical food chain. That's also why money and status are important here. Carrie is often financially unstable, anxious about her future, and completely avoidant around responsibility. Big represents safety and structure, and if he commits, she gets security and protection from her own self-destructive tendencies. She wouldn't have to fully grow up if someone else can hold it all together for her. But reality never matches the fantasy. Even in moments where Big does reciprocate, her internal issues don't just disappear. They're just lying dormant until he does something to screw it up again. We do also see evidence that full reciprocation actually weakens her obsession. When Big divorces Natasha after cheating on her with Carrie, something changes. Natasha represented the top of the hierarchy because of how composed, elegant and socially acceptable she was. And being chosen over Natasha, Carrie gets the validation she was chasing. She wins.
Well, let's just say it, you won.
And once she wins, the obsession fades and she seems interested in dating other people again. We see this again in the second movie. Big is committed and seems emotionally available for once, and yet Carrie is restless. He wants to stay at home and she feels bored. The chase is gone, and without the tension, the relationship feels flat. I believe that if Big had fully shown up earlier, Carrie may never have stayed obsessed. Limerence thrives on uncertainty, not stability, and whenever her self-esteem dips, like after Berger dumps her on a post-it, or after Alexander constantly prioritises himself over her, Big re-enters as a familiar source of validation and the cycle reignites. And this isn't because he's changed, but because her wounds have been activated all over again. Big could never truly give Carrie what she needed. He could offer moments of validation or status and excitement, but he could never heal the internal fractures that made her attached to him in the first place. The need was never really about Big. It was about what she believed being chosen by him would fix. Characteristics of the limerent object. Now that we've explored the dynamics of their relationship, let's delve into why Carrie and Big are particularly prone to this addictive pattern. To start off, Big is almost a textbook example of a limerent object, meaning he embodies many of the traits that often triggers intense fixation towards others. He's wealthy, he's socially powerful, he's older, confident, emotionally elusive, and busy and important, and never fully available. Scarcity makes him seem very compelling. Personality-wise, this is obviously subjective, but Carrie seems genuinely entertained by him. He's dry and a little condescending at times, but she reads that as charm. He also shows selective interest in Carrie, which is crucial. They share surface-level similarities, like smoking and drinking and joking and being out late, and he seems amused by her in a way that feels special. He watches her like she's entertainment, and Carrie leans into that role. She performs in jokes and monologues and flirts because his attention feels rewarding. That sense of being chosen or singled out feeds her attachment. But the defining feature is his emotional unavailability. He consistently deflects emotional conversations, and when Carrie tries to talk about feelings or commitment, he redirects with physical intimacy or by turning the question back on her. He avoids any labels, he won't sign the wedding card, he won't clearly define whether they're back together, he doesn't integrate her into his life or factor her into major decisions like moving to another country. His history also reinforces this pattern. He dates multiple women at once, and his first marriage was emotionally non-committal and involved infidelity. Even when Carrie is visibly distressed, crying and confronting him, he often remains detached. When she breaks up with him right before he goes to Paris, he avoids eye contact and just stands there. Or when she's emotional before his heart surgery, he dismisses it with a joke. And if he's really backed into a corner, he becomes defensive and defaults to,
I have to do things on my time frame.
Symbolically, Big represents more than just a man. He's authority and validation and legitimacy. He embodies the world Carrie wants access to, but isn't able to reach on her own. Characteristics of the limerent person. On the other hand, Carrie has several traits that make her especially vulnerable to limerence. Relative to Big, there's the low self-worth. She constantly measures herself against him, including his exes and his status, and she never fully feels like his equal. She also lacks that kind of secure attachment in her life that she craves. She has many friends and acquaintances, but she seems to deeply desire a romantic bond that feels anchoring and permanent.
Consuming. can't live without each other, love.
That unmet need makes her cling harder when something feels meaningful. Contrary to popular belief, I believe Carrie's attachment style is actually fearful avoidant, since healthy relationships don't actually calm her, but instead seem to bore or threaten her. With Aiden, someone emotionally open and consistent, she becomes emotionally unavailable herself. She pulls away to avoid depth and undermines the relationship, and seems more drawn to volatile relationships than stable ones. This type of disorganized attachment is often drawn to dismissive partners like Big, because there's no pressure or expectation to be vulnerable. She also sabotages other genuinely healthy options. With Ben, the guy with the Tweety Bird tattoo who seemed perfect, she ransacks his apartment for red flags because she needs to find something wrong. Because someone that good and that available likely triggers her belief that she's not up to standard, so she dismantles it before it can dismantle her. She also frequently dismisses her friends' emotions or turns them into jokes, suggesting discomfort with emotional intimacy across the board. There are also inner child wounds, which we'll come back to later, but we know her father abandoned her at a young age. That early loss most likely adapted her nervous system to chase emotionally unavailable figures and fear abandonment. Another important piece is her sense of entitlement. Carrie often assumes access to things such as her friends' time, money, emotional labour, even to public services. She's shocked when the dry cleaner is closed. She expects to be let off for smoking weed in public. She smokes cigarettes in places she shouldn't. She borrows money and emotional energy freely, and this entitlement extends to her romantic relationships too. She struggles to take no for an answer, whether it's pushing to get back with Aiden, tracking down Natasha after the affair, or feeling unsettled by the fact Big doesn't consistently choose her. It deeply destabilises her when she realises she's not entitled to him. Finally, Carrie has a clear pattern of monkey branching. She's almost never single. When one relationship ends, she moves quickly to the next or back to the familiar. The rare moments she's single, she describes herself as restless. After the affair with Big, she cycles through short-lived relationships and then returns to Aiden. When things falter with Alexander and Paris, her thoughts drift back to Big again. It's like a game of the floor is lava, and being alone is the one thing she can't tolerate. So when you put these two people together, it's easy to see how an unhealthy attachment would form. Why the limerent object doesn't choose them? One of the hardest truths in limerence is that the rejection often isn't mysterious at all, and with Big, the reason he doesn't fully choose Carrie are actually pretty consistent. First of all, he feels pressure and not desire. Big knows Carrie is emotional by nature. No matter how hard she tries to be cool or nonchalant, he can sense the depth of her investment. He knows that being with her would require emotional responsiveness and reassurance and reciprocation, things he's not equipped or willing to give. And I think on some level, he also fears being shamed or criticised for being cold and unable to open up. Carrie needs emotional engagement, and Big can't bear it. That alone makes full commitment feel suffocating to him. Instead of being accepted for who he is, he feels watched, measured and needed. And for someone avoidantly attached, that registers as threat and extreme discomfort. Secondly, he may sense idealisation rather than real closeness. Big knows he's on a pedestal. He knows Carrie sees him as something to win and something that would stabilise her. And with that comes heavy expectations, fidelity, availability, commitment. He understands, probably very clearly, that if he chose her fully, he'd be expected to become someone else, someone consistent and reliable, and he knows that's not who he is. So instead of feeling seen, he feels projected onto, desired for what he represents and not for who he is. An idealisation is flattering at first, but long term it's exhausting to meet those expectations. There's also his avoidant attachment and upward-seeking behaviour. Big constantly dates women who reflect his self-image, polished, socially appropriate and high status. Natasha fits that perfectly. She moves comfortably in his world. Big likely believes he deserves someone like that because he sees himself as high calibre. And we see this pattern early on, not just with Natasha. In the first season, Big is dating a brunette named Julia, the woman Carrie catches him with at a fancy restaurant, and there is a lot of contrast. This is not the Chinese takeout place he takes Carrie to. This is a more refined, socially appropriate setting and Julia fits there. But in Big's eyes, Carrie unfortunately does not. Also, Big has actually told his friend about Julia. In fact, when he sees Carrie at the party later, he initially assumes she's Julia. He's mentally placed Julia in the public girlfriend category, the woman you mention and introduce to your friends. Carrie at that point isn't even on that radar. He hasn't even mentioned her at all. And it's very possible that Julia ended things after Carrie showed up at the restaurant, because she likely carried herself with more class and self-respect. Carrie, on the other hand, always seemed to come with emotional intensity and the risk of being exposed. Not only does Big avoid commitment with her, he avoids being seen with her in certain spaces, and that speaks volumes about how he categorises women in his life. Those who enhance his image and those who destabilise it. To him, women are social currency. You can almost see him imagining Carrie at some formal dinner or high society party, smoking indoors, speaking out of turn and making a scene, and him internally cringing. The moment at the fancy house party where she tries to light up says everything. To him it's not quirky, it's embarrassing, and he even says so.
Like, I'm only a particular fragment of the kind of person you think that you should be dating.
His pattern also suggests a preference for brunettes, women who blend in and not stand out. Then there's fundamental incompatibility. Carrie is a social, chaotic, impulsive person. She likes to party and talk and process and feel. Big is more contained, controlled, private and grounded. He doesn't want to analyse emotions. He doesn't want to constantly negotiate closeness. He likely knows that long term he wouldn't be able to meet her energy or tolerate it without resentment. For example, in the second movie, they're at home together after a day at work and Big wants to put his feet up and relax, and Carrie's having none of it. She wants to go out and eat out somewhere, but eventually settles on staying in. At this point, I sense that Big is most likely exhausted by her high-maintenance personality. And finally, there's something else that often gets overlooked. Big is most comfortable as the limerent object, not as an equal partner. He seems to thrive when he's desired and idealised. He chooses when to engage and when to withdraw. Relationships for him often function like ladders he can climb to gain a higher status. This might explain his brief obsession with the movie star Willow Summers, who would have likely put him in magazines if they had got together, or his willingness to marry Natasha, and even his pattern of cheating. He wants to show that he's more superior than even the most high-value women. And that's also likely why Samantha didn't interest him in the first series. Samantha wouldn't pedestal him, and she wouldn't chase him. She would step over him before he could do it to her. Carrie, on the other hand, needs him, and ironically, that need is the very thing that ensures he never fully chooses her. The unconscious purpose of limerence. Limerence often exists because it's doing a job, and with Carrie it's doing several. At the most basic level, it helps her avoid pain. If Carrie is obsessing over Big, she doesn't have to sit with herself. She doesn't have to confront her deeper issues, her loneliness, or her unresolved pain from childhood abandonment. Being alone or still and unoccupied seems almost intolerable for her. So instead she stays busy, obsessing over men, compulsive shopping, having lunches, constantly socialising, drinking, smoking. All of it functions as a distraction. Big just happens to be the most potent one. Limerence also meets a very specific emotional need, validation, but at the same time it reinforces a painful core belief that she's not quite good enough. Big exists in a world she believes she doesn't fully belong in, and being obsessed with him just keeps alive the idea that she's still striving, but still falling just short. The chase confirms the belief that love must be earned, and that she has to prove herself to be chosen. Also, the sunk cost fallacy is definitely a factor here. Carrie has spent so many years trying to secure Big, and to give up on that now would mean that she'd have to admit she'd wasted some of the best years of her life. But the important thing to remember is that it's all adaptive behaviour. Carrie doesn't appear consciously aware of this pattern, but her nervous system is just repeating something familiar, not something logical. Her infatuation allows her to feel alive and emotionally engaged without having to risk true vulnerability, and in that way it protects her even while hurting her. I also realised that what often reignites her desire for Big isn't actually commitment, it's rejection. Before Big leaves for Napa, Carrie is relatively distracted. She's chasing other things and other men and other forms of validation, But the moment he announces he's leaving, she becomes desperate, needing to see him and convince him to stay. That loss of access is what reactivates the wound. This pattern shows up often outside of Big too. With Aiden, when he offered to introduce her to his parents, she freaks out and tells him she needs some space. But then when he backs off, she immediately panics and tries to draw him closer. Then when he's fully available and emotionally committed, she cheats, because there's no chase and no adrenaline. In the reboot, when Aiden becomes less available and his focus is elsewhere, suddenly she's bending over backwards for the same man, until he gets closer again and can see her more often, and then she pulls away. The interest wasn't in Aiden himself, it was the dynamic, which is why she then latches on to the hope for Duncan downstairs, who is also clearly unavailable. To me, it's striking how often Carrie becomes fixated with people who feel unreachable. Natasha, even, in a strange way, become an obsession herself. Carrie spends an extraordinary amount of time and energy trying to prove she's better than her, tracking her down and analysing her, then finally settling on calling her an idiot over a simple spelling mistake. But the truth is, she doesn't just want to beat Natasha, she wants to be her. And of course there's all the stalking she did after Big and Natasha's divorce. Which raises a question. If Carrie's father left when she was young, and there was later rejection or emotional absence when she tried to reconnect, could this relentless refusal to accept no from others be an unconscious attempt to repair that original wound, and to finally be loved by someone who once walked away? Ultimately, Limerence keeps her in a cycle of needing instead of healing, and until she pauses to look inwards, the man, aka the limerent object, may change, but the dysfunctional pattern won't. The inner child connection. When we look at Carrie's relationships through an inner child lens, it starts to make a lot more sense, and it becomes a bit less about poor choices and more about unfinished attachment wounds. Carrie mentions in the original series that her father left when she was young. The implication is that he quit on her and her mother when she was around 5 years old, which is a crucial developmental age. At that stage, children are forming their basic sense of safety and consistency, and a sudden disappearance at that time wires the nervous system to expect abandonment. There's also a small but significant moment where Carrie looks at a photograph of herself with her father from when she was about 3 years old. The photo is tucked inside a book on her desk and not on display, and in her narration she says, "Some people say a daughter's relationship with her father is the model for all subsequent relationships with men." The show pretty much spells it out to us. Carrie didn't grow up never having a father, but she grew up losing one. She experienced an attachment followed by absence. So as an adult, she's drawn to men who are present enough to activate hope and distant enough to recreate the original wound. She even openly refers of having daddy issues at one point, which suggests at least some awareness, but awareness doesn't automatically mean healing. We also see that Carrie appears largely disconnected from her family throughout the series. She lives independently, far from any remaining relatives, and family rarely features in her emotional support system, and that kind of estrangement can amplify loneliness and reinforce the sense that you're on your own emotionally, even when surrounded by friends. So how does Big fit into all of this? Big is kind of like a father figure, especially since he calls Carrie kid a lot.
Hey kid.
Whether that's intentional or not, it places her in a younger, less powerful role and speaks directly to her inner child. On an unconscious level, Big represents a chance to repair the original attachment. If this emotionally distant, authoritative figure finally chooses her, then maybe the original abandonment can be undone. That would also explain why she keeps trying harder instead of walking away. Young children don't usually detach from parents who abandon them because they need them for survival. So instead they adapt and perform and become hyper-attuned. And Carrie does all of that with Big. She changes herself to try and prevent abandonment. The tragic thing is that no romantic partner can heal a childhood wound that was never addressed. And until that inner child feels safe, seen and nurtured from within, Carrie will keep gravitating towards men who fulfill this familiar pattern. And from the nervous system's perspective, this type of familiarity feels like home, even when it hurts. Love versus limerence. So at this point we can stop theorising and actually assess the relationship. If we put Carrie and Big against the basic love versus limerence framework, the result is pretty clear. On the limerence side, Carrie ticks every single box. She has constant intrusive thoughts about Big, She's actively seeking his affection and approval. Her focus is on how to attract him and keep him and not lose him. She idealizes him even when the evidence contradicts that image. She needs him for validation. His stress levels are permanently elevated. She plays emotional games to win him back. Her world revolves around his availability, and her body is clearly living in fight or flight mode with the mixture of adrenaline and dopamine. Now let's compare that to love. Love allows preoccupation to settle. It's about giving and not chasing. It focuses on nurturing the other person. It sees flaws clearly and accepts them. It feels steady and safe. It allows open communication. It leaves room for a separate, fulfilling life. And biologically, it produces calming hormones, not constant stress. Not once does Carrie live in that state with Big. Let's also look at some of the other criteria for limerence. Do they truly know and accept each other? No, Carrie barely knows Big at all. She doesn't really know what he does day to day for work, even though it's a huge part of his life. She doesn't know about deeply personal things, like the fact he had a dog grown up that he clearly loved, so much so that he kept a photo of it in his wallet, which he found after Big died. He hadn't even been inside her apartment before she thought she was falling in love with him.
I realized that not only did Big not love me, he had absolutely no idea who I was.
And even the things she does know about him, she doesn't fully accept as part of who he is. She doesn't accept his need for distance and control, and he doesn't accept her emotional nature. So instead of compromising on these differences, she bulldozes through them by pushing timelines and trying to accelerate intimacy. But what's interesting is that when Big does show emotional openness, she can't tolerate that either. There's a moment later in the series, after her book signing, when Big asks her genuinely,
"Was I really that bad?"
He gives her a clear opening to talk about how much he hurt her. And instead of taking this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, she shuts it down by saying, "You are fine." And then she diverts into physical intimacy, the exact thing he did to her for years. So she doesn't just reject his avoidance side, she also rejects his slightly vulnerable side. Next, can they communicate without fear? No, even basic conversations turn into deflections. "Why didn't you call?"
Why didn't you call?
Nothing ever gets resolved, they just go in circles. Is the focus on nurturing or needing? Definitely needing. Big doesn't nurture her emotionally, spiritually, or practically, and Carrie doesn't nurture him either. She needs him to be something for her. So the big question, could this ever genuinely work? In my opinion, no, not as they are. Big isn't emotionally open enough for Carrie, and he only seems comfortable with her when she's a very specific version of herself. But even if he did change, it still wouldn't work, because Carrie isn't actually available for secure love either. She craves intensity and excitement, and all of those things don't coexist with the calm, grounded nature of real love. I personally also think that neither of them has the kind of compassion and empathy needed to nurture another person in a real relationship. For example, after the affair is over and Natasha moves out, they talk about how they feel as if they've been through a war and are like war buddies. Yet neither of them actually mentions how it affected their partners, the ones who were actually cheated on. They would both need serious individual therapy. Big to explore his emotional unavailability and avoidance of intimacy, and Carrie to repair the inner wounds driving her obsession and fear of abandonment. But the reality is, neither of them seem particularly willing to do the work. Carrie even quits therapy in the original series when she realises she might be the problem. It's easier for both of them to organise their lives around the dysfunction than to face it directly. So what's the conclusion? This isn't love. It's not even limerence that turns into love. It's pure limerence stretched over years.
It wasn't logic. It was limerence.
It's normal to experience this at the start of a relationship, but to be years down the line and still in the same predicament isn't healthy. Even in the films, the pattern doesn't change. She still expects rejection, and her decisions revolve around managing that fear. She actually cheats on Big in the second movie, even though they've been married for a while, because he wants a few nights a week to himself, which is a request that shouldn't threaten a secure bond. And even in the reboot, right up until Big dies, the dynamic is fundamentally the same. It's interesting how Carrie appeared far more devastated when Big jilted her at the altar because of the humiliation and ego injury than she is after his death. She even asks Miranda, was Big a big mistake? And while everyone grieves differently, There's an argument to be made that his death brought a kind of relief because the game is over. He can no longer hurt her, she will always be his wife, therefore she's won. And with that chapter closed, she's free to move on to the next chase, Aiden, which tells us everything we need to know. Big and Carrie's relationship was never about love. It was about validation and a cycle that neither of them truly escaped. Therapist's point of view, how to heal. The first and most difficult intervention would be emotional withdrawal from Big. In theory, no contact is simple, but in Carrie's world it's almost impossible. She seems to bump into him everywhere, bars, parties, boats, and nowhere ever feels safe for her nervous system. We see this immediately after their first breakup when she runs into him at a bar, and again when he's married and she unexpectedly encounters him at a boat party. Each time, whatever healing she's managed instantly resets. Even when physical distance exists, like when he moves to Napa, the emotional tether remains. The moment he returns, she's pulled straight back in. And complicating things further is the fact that every time she tries to move on, he literally reappears at her doorstep. Big does not respect emotional boundaries. He calls, shows up at her apartment, and inserts himself back into her life just as she's stabilising. Because the show is set in the late 90s, early 2000s, social media isn't an issue. But phone access still is, so he's able to leave voicemails that she then obsessively analyses. Even when she doesn't respond, the contact alone dysregulates her. If she was my client, I'd be honest with her. Full no contact would be extremely difficult, but not impossible. It would require telling him clearly not to contact her, not to show up at her apartment, and if feasible, changing her number. She did do this in the final season before moving to Paris, but then her friends encouraged him to go and get her, which in my opinion was more about separating her from Alexander and bringing her back to New York than it was about getting her back with Big. Full no contact sounds drastic, but given how much each interaction affects her, it might actually be necessary. At the very least, she'd need to avoid places he frequents for a while, not forever, but long enough for her nervous system to settle and adapt. Interestingly, the person who models this best in the show is Natasha. After the divorce, she seems to cut both Carrie and Big out completely and moves on with her life. When Carrie later hunts her down, Natasha is calm, firm and clear that she wants nothing to do with either of them. Carrie should have taken a leaf out of her book and done the same thing with Big. That kind of clean break is really the only way to escape him for good. She did also do this when Big moved to Paris. She wasn't able to contact him and he didn't contact her, and Carrie seemed to be moving on by dating other people, though she did still think about Big. So at this point, she would be in therapy and beginning no contact. Next would come grief and withdrawal, which Carrie would feel intensely. We've already seen how this looks for her. After their first breakup, she cries for weeks, withdraws socially, smokes and drinks more, ruminates constantly and struggles to function. She later bumps into Big while out with a new Yankee, and I would say that moment she was probably at the peak of the withdrawal. And had she just held on a little bit longer and leaned into the grief instead of reconnecting, she might have just made it through. I would expect increased drinking, smoking, neglecting her health, eating poorly, isolating herself, or alternatively seeing friends but talking about Big non-stop, which we also see after their second breakup. Her writing would likely suffer too, because when Carrie is dysregulated, her creativity dries up. At this point, support networks would be essential, but only if used properly. Carrie has strong friendships, and in the early stages of breakups, her friends generally show up for her, but she also has a tendency to emotionally dump everything onto them, which eventually exhausts the relationship, like when they push her towards therapy because they're tired of hearing about Big. And the thing is, therapy didn't fail to work for Carrie. Carrie just wasn't ready for it. She went because her friends wanted her to, not because she wanted to look inward. And in my experience, those are often the most challenging clients, because they're not yet willing to take responsibility for their patterns.
Wake up, Carrie. How many more times are you going to go through this? He is bad for you.
If she were my client, I'd prioritise building a plan she actually agrees with and can stick to. There's no point in forcing insight before safety and trust are established, and without that, nothing would change. Inner child healing would be the core of the work. First, we would slowly identify inner child wounds, particularly abandonment, and build trust around exploring them. Then we'd identify the core beliefs formed from those experiences and start working to reframe them. The main question I would ask her is, what does Big symbolically represent? We'd explore how that belief shaped her choices and how her relationship with Big temporarily soothes and reinforces those wounds. The goal would be to meet those needs internally rather than outsourcing them to unavailable men. We would also work on rebuilding self-esteem so that it extends beyond romantic relationships. Carrie's instability isn't only relational, it shows up in her finances, with her impulsive spending and partying, and her unstable career path in the early seasons. So rebuilding self-esteem would involve stabilising multiple areas of her life. This would also include cognitive behavioural therapy, as well as journaling, developing new hobbies, creating structure, and examining why she gravitates towards volatility over security and why commitment feels suffocating. This would be long-term work. Honestly, I think she would need therapy for quite a while, possibly even bi-weekly sessions at the start. There's a lot to unpack and she deeply identifies with her patterns. I'd also consider recommending something like SLAA, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, or a similar support group like CODA to add an element of accountability, especially around maintaining no contact. I'd also strongly suggest abstaining from relationships for a few weeks at the beginning, which would feel incredibly uncomfortable and isolating for her because she's a serial relationship hopper, but it would give her the best chance at a real change. Eventually, after some time, casually dating other people might be okay, as long as it's not being used to avoid pain or replace Big. But early on, grief needs space, otherwise it just gets recycled. And finally, relapse would be very likely. Big knows exactly when to appear, usually when she's vulnerable and alone, and he could easily show up at her apartment and promise that he's changed. And given their history, it would be completely understandable for her to fall back into it, like she repeatedly does. Preventing relapse would require external structure, maybe even a roommate for a while who could ward off Big. She would also need to develop some self-awareness so that she's able to pause long enough to make different choices. Overall, I think as long as Carrie was willing to put her all into recovery from this emotional addiction, and with the help of a good therapist, it would be entirely possible to rebuild a much better life. Life after limerence. After healing, even partially, Carrie would likely feel much more stable within herself. Her nervous system wouldn't be in a constant state of activation, so she'd need fewer compulsive distractions to cope. Emotionally, I'd expect she'd feel less mixed up and less reactive. And physically, that would likely translate into better health too, as well as better sleep and fewer stress-driven habits. When you're no longer living in fight or flight around one person, your whole system benefits. One of the biggest changes would show up in her friendships. Carrie projects heavily onto her friends when she's limerent, using them as therapists and emotional containers. With more internal stability, she'd have the headspace to support them more equally instead of it being so one-sided. Romantically, she'd finally have space for a more secure, grounded relationship. One that feels safe and steady, that doesn't constantly set off alarms the way safety did with Aiden in the early days. Instead of mistaking calm for boredom, she'd understand her triggers and be less likely to self-sabotage. That doesn't mean the relationship would be effortless, but it would be workable. She could stay present through discomfort and communicate instead of fleeing and rejecting the relationship outright. Without limerence consuming her mental energy, Carrie would naturally have more time to focus on other areas of her life. Her career, creativity and self-care would no longer be deprioritized in favour of romantic obsession. Her life would feel more fulfilling because it's no longer organised around one unavailable person. And crucially, if Big did reappear, which knowing him he probably would, she'd be far less likely to take the bait. His old tricks wouldn't land the same way because she would no longer need what he represented. So when you really zoom out and look at Carrie and Big as a whole, what we're mostly seeing isn't some great love story, it's limerence that never fully resolves. At the beginning the intensity makes sense, but what's important here is that even when they're officially together, even when they're married, there's still an imbalance. And that's something worth taking note of, because intense chemistry isn't always a green flag. A lot of the time it's actually old, unhealed wounds being reactivated. And I really want to normalise this. Experiencing limerence doesn't mean there's something wrong with you or that you're incapable of love. It's an incredibly common experience. What matters most is how long you stay stuck in it, how much of yourself you lose, and whether it starts to cost you your peace or your sense of self. If you recognise yourself in any part of this, I go into all of these sections in much more depth in my book, Letting Go of a Romantic Obsession by Sophie April. It's designed to help you apply this framework to your own life, and at the moment the ebook is available on Amazon for only 77 pence. I also have a novel which depicts limerence in more detail called Pick Me by Sophie Hessian, which is also available at the same price on Amazon, both of which you'll find in the description below. And I'd really love to know, who should I analyse next? Drop a comment and let me know which character, film or TV show you'd like to see in an upcoming video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. You and I are like that red wall. It's a good idea in theory, but somehow it doesn't quite work.